the Wildlife Observer Network.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Onward for Wildlife, a political podcast from the Wildlife Observation Network. I'm your host, Tyke James, and today we're going on word with Jasmine Murphy. She has her master's in environmental policy and management at American Public University after earning her bachelor's of science in zoology at UC Santa Barbara. She has two books that we're going to be talking about today. One, Americans Hate Coyotes, and a hot read for the summer, You're Not a Conservationalist. She's a SciCommer, and we're very happy to have her. And we're going to have her first just kick off and explain what does SciComm mean, because I think that will get us started right where we need to be in this.
All right, that sounds awesome. Okay, first I want to say thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited. This is my first podcast interview ever, so I'm really excited. So SciComm. SciComm is just a mashup word of science communication. And basically the goal of science communication is to make scientific literature and scientific research available to the public and not keep it so exclusive to academia. So there's so many different ways to do SciComm, and just going on hashtag SciComm on Twitter or hashtag science Twitter, you'll see so many different approaches to it. There are people that do makeup tutorials and teach you about the different plumage of birds based on the color of their makeup. Then you have people like me who do science threads once or twice a week and, teach you either about a particular piece of scientific literature or a particular species. So it's just this huge world of, the movement of making scientific research and literature more accessible and freely available to the public.
That's awesome. And this is something I want to touch on a little later after we get on the meat and potatoes. But you have a platform called Black Flower Science Co. And my understanding is that is one of your avenues as a creator and writer that you do your SciComm through, when you say?
Yes. So that is a huge part of my SciComm work. I've actually been doing science-related and science-themed blogging since 2015, when I first started in my whole kind of research and communication outreach journey. I went to Serengeti National Park to study wildebeest, and I started a platform for just telling people about my experience. And so that over time has evolved into Black Flower Science Co., where my goal is to increase representation of people of color in academia, in STEM, and also representation and inclusivity for neurodivergent people, because I am somebody who struggles with, well, I won't say struggles with, who lives with mental illness. I have generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD and depression, and so that's a lot of people are discriminated against in academia as a whole, but especially in STEM when others find out, they struggle with these kinds of things. And so that's part of my goal, is just making making it easier to talk about and making it normal for people with these conditions to feel like, hey, I'm a scientist too. I don't have to be afraid to talk about these things and live in fear that my research is going to be condescended upon or something.
Yeah, you wouldn't want that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. So we're going to get right into what I like to call the meat and potatoes. So the title of this episode is called The Subject Line of the Email That You Sent My Colleague, which was Federal Cruelty to Coyotes. Would you mind expounding on that?
Yeah, so I'm very, very vocal about this. I am not a fan of the federal agency called Wildlife Services. They are a division of the United States Department of Agriculture, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services. So that's USD-APHIS Wildlife Services. The reason that I am not happy with them, and actually a lot of scientific organizations, especially American Society of Mammalogists, over decades have not been happy with them. And the reason being is that they implement extremely biased lethal control measures against coyotes. And these methods are extremely indiscriminate. They've killed millions, and that is not an exaggeration. They've killed millions of native animals, native species to North America, just in their obsessive focus on killing coyotes. And since 1996, actually, they've killed over 3 million coyotes. And it's disgusting to even say that. But it's based on just this old Western mentality of, predators are the enemy, they're competitors, because, hunters want to hunt deer and elk and things like that. And any predator, whether it be a coyote, whether it be a wolf, a mountain lion, they're seen as competition. Which, I mean, ecologically, I guess you can sort of say they are, but the way that we go about managing them is entirely based on this idea that they are some kind of pest that needs to be done away with. And the entire operation of wildlife services is so centered on that. And they refuse to even see their own research that proves that non-lethal management, not exclusively, but an integrated approach, something that they claim to have right now, but an integrated approach between non-lethal and lethal management is the best option. And that's been proven over and over again, even by their own researchers. And yet they continue obsessive lethal control.
Okay. I have a couple questions to help clear some things up for the audience, because you gave us a few things that were acronyms, and we want to break a few of those down to help us catch up where you are. So okay. One of the acronyms you used was ADC.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what that is?
Yeah. So basically, the ADC Act is the Animal Damage Control Act, and that's something that's been in effect since 1931. And the core, and this is just based on some of the literature that I've read on this topic, the core of this and why it's a problem is because it allows wildlife services to use private funding for all of their operations. So the problem with that is that it introduces a lot of conflict of interest. And, when we talk about, this is all in the context, because, you have to talk about all of the context here.
Yes, please.
This is all in the context of the early 1900s, when European settlers were coming in, and wiped out the bison populations, wiped out the prey species of coyotes and wolves. And so because they did that, then coyotes and wolves and other predators started to depredate livestock. And since then, it's been like this huge war, like this turf war that we've been fighting for hundreds of years now. And what the ADC Act does is it allows people or agencies or, agricultural professionals, whatever they may be, hunting agencies, it doesn't even matter. If they have a specific interest in eliminating coyotes or quote unquote managing them in a lethal manner, then they are able to fund wildlife services. And because they are funding, they are direct stakeholders, which means that they have a say in the way that the agency goes about managing these animals. And there's a lot more to the ADC Act, but that's the most problematic piece of it, is because that's been in effect since 1931, and many people have called them out for it and asked for it to be addressed, but it stays the same.
Help me understand, where in the federal government can I find wildlife services?
So they're kind of like a subdivision. So you're gonna hear them, and it's a little bit in a gray area, because I've seen them addressed as only under the USDA, but I also see them addressed under the APHIS, which is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services. So it seems a little bit vague, but generally they're under the USDA. And their primary purpose is to mitigate quote unquote wildlife damage. And to me, that's such a problematic term, because it already is human focused.
Yeah.
What of damage can wildlife do to their own, their native habitats? But that's I won't say the entire, but that is the primary purpose of wildlife services, is to mitigate that under the USDA.
A phrase you used I would love for you to define, or at least to provide some examples on, is non-lethal management, or non-lethal wildlife management. You also talked about lethal wildlife management. I think most people can assume what exactly that means, but can you just tell me the difference between those two, maybe some examples, help us understand what's actually happening to the
Yeah.
coyotes?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so starting with lethal management, I want to explain a little bit what I mean about it being indiscriminate. So I'm pretty sure that most people in North America have been, have heard a story every now and then of dogs going into, the woods behind the backyard or something like that and dying because of a poison trap or, a leg hold trap, something like that. These types of measures are used with the intention of killing one or more, often more, um, coyotes and lethally removing them from an area so that any sort of interaction, negative or neutral, honestly, so that any sort of interaction doesn't happen again. And the reason that I call that indiscriminate, or that many refer to it as indiscriminate, is because there's no way to specify it to the coyote. If a dog, which, has happened multiple times and has actually happened with children too. If a dog or a child or any other living thing goes up to one of those baited traps and it's baited with poison, or excuse me, not baited with poison, but loaded with poison, then it's going to kill them too. There's no way to specify or make exclusive these types of control methods. They've also done things as they've destroyed coyote dens, which in some cases requires some sort of explosive device or just things of that nature. These things are so out of our control. You can't determine what animal approaches poison. You can't determine what animal runs in front of, any sort of trap or any sort of gunshot. Like it doesn't, you can't control those things. So that's what I mean when I say indiscriminate lethal control. When it comes to non-lethal control, there's a lot of different ways that you can handle this, and that's why non-lethal control is so much more effective than lethal, because with lethal control you're just taking care of the problem very temporarily. There's going to be another coyote born, there's going to be another one that immigrates into the space that was left by the one that was removed. It happens, and it's called the rebound effect, but we'll get into that at another time. But yeah, there's no way to control this. And so on the the non-lethal side is when you start to open up all sorts of avenues of learning coyote behavior, learning coyote ecology and cognition. And the reason that you would have to learn these things is because you need to, quote unquote, teach the animal to avoid humans again, because they've gone through what's called, they've experienced habituation. And what that means is they've gotten used to people. They've gotten used to being in these anthropogenic spaces so much so that they live there now. We share these habitats now.
Like
I was talking.
raccoons or possums. I can think of a few things. The Urban Wildlife podcast does talk a lot about urban wildlife, and I think coyotes definitely belong in that, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There's entire urban ecosystems now, that are there to stay. This is now a natural thing for them. Pigeons is another great example. Crows, ravens, they're all a part of these concrete jungles, I'll say.
Mhm.
And they've adapted to living alongside us. And so these non-lethal measures would allow us to continue to share that space, but share it in a way that is supportive of coexistence. And it gets rid of this idea that we need to be separate, that we are somehow separate. I think that's something that people are really struggling with seeing, and that goes back to us seeing as coyotes as just pests that need to be done away with. I think it's very easy to forget when we're in suburban neighborhoods and things like that, that they are a native species to North America. They were here far before we were. They evolved right alongside the gray wolf. This was between like 3 and 5 million years ago. Humans, I think, are only a couple 100,000 years old. So it's like,
Yeah, we're new here. We're new here.
Yeah, we're new here. Like, this isn't
We're
something
still
that
figuring it out.
the coyote. So anyway, to summarize, yes, non-lethal control would be implementing things such as environmental changes. So do you need to get rid of a ton of vegetation in your backyard? Do you need to stop feeding, like leaving pet food out? Do you need to stop, just generally interacting with wildlife in the way that you currently are, identifying what are some behaviors that might be attracting coyotes to your neighborhood. So training and educating the public, but also implementing measures that are effective for the way that coyotes think and behave, to encourage them to, not maybe share so much space with us or share space with us in a different way. So there's so many different ways to implement that.
Yeah, I really like. I mean, the way you said that made me think about a term that probably exists, but I wrote it down for the first time: moral ecology. Because you
Okay.
talked about how non-lethal management is a way to address the habits of humans and coyotes,
Hmm.
so that that can in one way, with less resources, perhaps mitigate the threats posed by coyotes. That's just an interesting idea. But just so we fully understand why they being wildlife services, are so attached to coyotes. You said they killed 3 million since the 90s.
Yeah, and
Is it
that's
a
ones that they
overpopulation
actually.
problem? Has it been coyote interactions with humans have gone up? Has a human ever been killed by a coyote? Like, what do you think is like the underpinning of this massive, it seems, narrative that coyotes are like this threat that need to be extinguished, not just dealt with, but extinguished. Even to the point that, and I hope you can mention this more, that there's a few states that have killing contests.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That's a very popular thing, coyote derbies.
Have you ever been to one?
No, I'd never until I'm trying to remember the first time I even heard about this. I think it was from okay, so I'm context. I'm from a rural town. Um, and so a lot of these things were just kind of like briefly introduced to me just throughout my childhood. And I never thought that much about them, but I think it was when I was in high school, either when I was in high school or just leaving for college, that I started hearing these stories about like just people being proud of how many coyotes they had killed that day or just something like that. And it was just it was really weird to me. Um,
Oh wow.
that anybody would be proud of something like that. And just
Hmm.
super brief disclaimer, I'm not anti-hunting in total. There are a lot of different caveats, but this in particular is not something that I support.
That's what I was gonna ask you about hunting.
Yeah. So basically the coyote derby, what that is, and it's not just for coyotes, they do it for like mountain lion, or they can't do that, that's quite illegal. But they do it
Oh.
for, nuisance slash predator species that they are legally
Hmm.
allowed to kill in mass. Foxes being another one. Yeah, so they basically get together. They are, hunters, whether it be amateurs, whether it be professionals, whatever. Anybody that has an interest in killing coyotes will get together and determine a set period of time in which everybody kills either the most coyotes they can or the biggest coyotes they can. And
Oh wow.
for this they receive compensation. It can be prizes like really cool belts or apparel, or sometimes it's money prizes.
Now,
Um,
who organizes the events? Are these events that are put on by your local coyote killing chapter of New Mexico, or is this something that's organized by the city, the county, the
I
state, the federal government?
It's definitely not something that's associated with governmental authorities, to my knowledge. I actually really don't know who puts these together. I think it's just a collective enthusiast kind of group of, we're all hunters in this area, local hunters. Let's get together and just have a derby. That's, to
I was
my
about to say,
understanding.
how is that regulated? Yeah, yeah, yeah. That seems troubling because my question is, how do you regulate that? And is there somebody from like the State Department of Game that
Yeah.
officiates the game and officiates the sport in some way, or
So
make
that
sure that they might be on state-owned land, like a state park, to do that? Like, I wonder how the government is involved in such an enterprise.
Yeah, so okay, so that's a really good question because it's not something that is regulated per se. And the reason I say that is because it's entirely legal, because there are no bag limits, no possession limits on many different, they're called non-fur-bearing mammals, or just non-game as well. But so those include obviously your coyotes. I believe one of the foxes, probably gray foxes, are in there. But basically, the point is there are no federal or state imposed limits, the legal term of kill, pursue, hunt, anything like that, in any given time frame throughout the entire year. So legally, you can kill as many coyotes you want without repercussion. But there are states that have recently implemented laws that forbid these coyote derbies. So California and Arizona are two of them. I know there's a handful more, but there are specific laws now that make that practice, that entire game, illegal because it's legal. It's unfortunately very legal to kill that many animals just for the heck of it.
Well, according to the Center of Biological Diversity, according from a press release dated April 2nd, 2019, New Mexico is bans destructive coyote killing contest, and the governor signed a bill abolishing organized competition killing of coyotes for prizes and entertainment. I do want to say that this bill, according to the same source, this bill did have bipartisan support in the state house in New Mexico. So this is definitely something that perhaps is getting a second look at because, like you said, it was the settlers coming from Europe during the 1900s, early 1900s, that were quote unquote manifesting destiny while wiping out, the populations of bison, the populations of wolves and coyotes still, to what we have today. Added on this press release, just to add this to your point, California banned the awarding of prizes for killing fur bearer, not forebearer. That was on me. So things that bear fur, as you could imagine, and non-game species in 2014. And Vermont banned coyote killing contests in 2018. Cities and counties in Arizona, New Mexico, and Wisconsin have passed resolutions condemning wildlife killing contests. So that is inclusive to coyotes, but I'm imagining that may include, as you said, foxes and mountain lions.
What I want to point out about that, about this really positive spreading about, policy changes and all of this kind of stuff, is that, and there's a lot of literature on this lately, this is an illustration of the kind of evolution of public perspectives and public values on wildlife management and how that's influencing these policy changes. Because I hate to bring this up because it was a really transformative time, but it was also, a lot of environmentalists were kind of just like, duh, that was their reaction. But as far as Cecil the Lion, when Cecil the Lion happened, the entire world woke up to environmental welfare and wildlife welfare. And so since then, there's been so much more action on the general public side of things in terms of influencing changes and legislation that's been in place for years, for decades, for as long as the US has been around and had like federal law and blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. Because of that huge reaction of to Cecil the Lion's death, we've seen a lot more people get more vocal about what they care about in wildlife management and how, them learning that they can be involved in that process. And it's been awesome, but at the same time, it's sad because this has been going on for so long and so many people have been fighting for this. And it took that long to do something about it. But on the positive end, yes, there has been a lot of change regarding coyote derbies and predator killing contests and just that sort of, I'll hold off on the word that I was going to use, but that sort of not great entertainment is where I will leave that.
All right, that's fair. Fair. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to argue there. So I think one of the things you highlighted really well was how social, or how like a community of people who once were not aware of these situations, not aware of these conditions for wildlife, now feel a sense of obligation, or maybe feel a sense of responsibility or a sense of obligation to speak to their elected officials and to move some things, to get some things happening. And, I want to ask you, is there any bill that you're currently looking at in Congress, or any legislation that you're watching move that's going to address this issue, either by part or in whole? Or if such legislation doesn't exist, what would you propose as as an amendment to what that program exists, if you don't think about outright abolishing it?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that I have a specific piece of legislation in mind right now, but and I was just listening, actually, it was Urban Wildlife podcast that I was just listening to about this, and a couple of other things. But I think the biggest issue right now, which is connected to a whole network of other issues, is the construction of the border wall. The reason that I have an issue with this is because very few people are talking about the effect this is going to have on not just wildlife in general, but the way they're able to migrate between places, immigrate between, just the continental United States and down into South America, because a lot of our North American species are also native to Central and South America. And some of coyotes have kind of expanded down that way. So it's not going to necessarily damage the coyote in the way that it's going to damage other species. But the reason that is, the way that relates to coyotes is, if you kind of if you cut off that migratory route in such a way, that's going to affect so many prey species, but also predator species. And that's going to be another form of competitive release on the coyotes. And they're going to start expanding even more because they have less to compete with, or they have weaker predator populations to compete with. There's so many different ways that that's going to affect native wildlife in North America in general. But then the network of issues that I kind of alluded to is also the fact that since this administration came into the White House, there have been, I believe, somewhere in the 40s or 50s of environmental regulations that have been overturned or completely pulled back, completely undone. And that is something that I'm very concerned with. So that's why I say I don't have particularly one piece of legislation in mind, because there are so many things that are being completely reversed that we just can't afford it at this point. We can't afford it anymore. And so I would just say, on the state level, make sure you're paying attention to who you're voting into office in terms of their environmental perspectives, the sorts of laws that they either seem like they would support or are on record supporting. And then as far as federal government, we need to get that guy out of there, because he's quite literally killing us and killing all of our native wildlife. So I couldn't possibly in this time narrow it down to just one law or one individual. I just feel like there's too much to be done.
You speak very humbly. The regulatory state of environmental laws and statutes that by executive action can be, as you said, rolled back or interpreted differently, or, as you said, just completely written off.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot that we enjoyed for a while. And we don't realize how easy or sometimes how structured government is. And when you can pull one thing out from that structure for whatever political reason you want to pull this small statue out, that topples, the effects that can lead to can topple an entire ecosystem. And, maybe, and I don't think folks don't know this, or if they do know this, they don't care. And the folks particularly that I'm mentioning are the ones that get elected and get sworn in and then become our lawmakers and interpreters.
Yeah.
So what was it about coyotes that really got you?
Actually, it was completely just by happenstance, because this came out of one assignment for, it was at the beginning of my master's program. And I had to come up with a topic for, developing an environmental management plan. And so I didn't know what to talk about, so I chose community gardens, and it was so boring. I love gardening, I really do, but
Yeah, don't let the garden club hear that. Don't let the garden club hear
yeah,
that.
I know. I'm sorry, everybody who likes gardening, but it was such a boring thing. I was not driven to talk about it. I found no passion in it whatsoever. And so I had to change it because, if you don't care about what you're writing, then
Truly,
it's
truly.
gonna be really it's not gonna be a good product.
Yeah, and
So
also like I don't think there's anyone going around indiscriminately killing community gardens. And if
gardens,
there
right? Yeah.
was, oh my God,
I
that
think
would
they're
that would be
doing
a
okay
topic.
right
But
now.
if
Yeah.
that were to be the case, oh man, who would? Oh, oh boy, my blood
But
boils just thinking about it.
yeah, so I was just super bored with that, so I was like, I need to change this. Like, I'm
Hmm.
not gonna get through this program because it if that topic that you chose, you could choose to have it, throughout your program. That could be your study topic, your study species, whatever. So I had to take a couple days and just kind of think about like what isn't really addressed right now. What is a huge problem that everybody knows about but nobody's doing anything about? And so I just started thinking of, what's special to my hometown? Where do I, what have I been exposed to environmentally throughout my childhood? And I realized that I see coyotes absolutely everywhere. So I started looking up sample management plans for them and started learning about how relatively little research on this species, just because of the overall negative sentiment towards them. But not only that, there's not really that many management plans in effect for them. People just kind of write them off as their pests. We got to kill them and just leave it at that. So I got really interested in, why do we hate them so much? Why aren't we doing anything about it? Why have they expanded everywhere? And it was just this rabbit hole that I'm still going down. Because it's just really interesting to me that this animal that everybody sees in North America, that everybody shares a living space with. There's no way to get away from coyotes at this point. But yet people know so little about them. Everything that we know about them, and we being the general public, is entirely based in myth.
I'll definitely say that I'm one of those people of the public where most of what I know about coyotes is surrounded in myth. I thought coyotes order contraptions from Acme Company and
Yeah.
try to use
Yeah,
it
me
to
too.
capture a roadrunner. I thought that was the point, but turns out coyotes are not bipedal. That was
Yeah,
one of the first things I learned. But coyotes do not normally walk on two legs and
yeah.
have
It's a hard lesson.
anthropomorphic expressions.
Hmm.
So I'm one of those people. I'll be humble enough to say that.
Yeah, it's hard. It's devastating to learn those things, but yeah. So I was just so drawn to them after a while. And I've always had a place in my heart for predatory species. I just love them. I've always been about big cats, which is why I thought I was gonna go the big cat route with my master's. But something about coyotes, they really got me. So yeah.
Well, I'm sure they're more than blessed to have you as a strong ally. And
Thank you.
if there's anything that we can do to get more management plans or to get better management plans, what can someone do if they're in high school or if they're in college and they're just like, well, if we need more good ideas, where do I put them or where do I go to put these good ideas to good use?
Okay, so there are a couple things that you can do as individuals. Um, it's really easy to find management plans if you can just go and type it into Google and just coyote management plan, and you'll find the different cities and stuff that actually have them in place, because there's really not that many across the US. And you can start looking at the different samples if you're interested in that. Start looking at those and probably looking, just comparing it to your city, like what of this plan are we doing and what are we not doing? Um, and if you're so inclined, then you can begin to contact local authorities. It doesn't have to be your local government. You can talk to wildlife officials. For instance, if you're in California, you can also contact the Fish and Wildlife Department. So there's things on a legislative level you can do, but on an individual level, to I won't say help coyotes because they're doing great. They will not be. That's one of the things also that I was drawn to about them is they expand despite adversity, despite us trying to kill them for the last several hundred years. They have managed to grow across the entire continent, which is good and bad. But on an individual level, what you can do to help the coexistence, is a better way to say it, between humans and coyotes, is really paying attention to how you're behaving in the natural environment. And the natural environment includes your suburban neighborhood. That's something that a lot of people need to get through their heads now, is they are here. They're here to stay. So some things you can do: do not leave pets outside unattended. That is one of the biggest things. People leave small pets outside and then are surprised when a coyote takes it, when a hawk takes it, when an owl takes it. You're sharing space with these animals now. This is not something that we can negotiate.
Now they're sharing food.
Yeah, and we're sharing food now, and that's another thing, is people leaving pet food out, whether it be just forgotten dog bowls out for their pets, or if they're doing feral cat feeding stations, which I will not go into. But
oh Lord, we could do it, but we could do it.
We absolutely could, but we will not.
Listen. I do have to plug that the Urban Wildlife Podcast has at least 2 or 3. I know one particular episode about feral cats, but they mention it, to some degree, or have somebody speak on it at least 2 or 3 times. So feel free to check out Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Yeah, they have awesome information there. I think it is too. I don't know. But so that is something that many supporters of feral cat colonies do not realize, is that they are contributing to this problem of well-off coyote populations in urban or anthropogenic areas, because they will come to these feeding stations. It doesn't even have to be cat food or dog food. They'll come for your trash. They'll come for bird feed. They're omnivores, and this is another thing that people don't understand about coyotes, is that they are opportunistic omnivores. They most likely will be eating, if it's not human food or human waste or anything like that, they'll be eating berries. They'll eat small mammals. They'll eat other plant vegetation, and it's so uncommon for them to go and take down a deer or something like that. That's something that people think coyotes do all the time, is just constantly attacking deer and cows and lambs. Like that's not something that they do. They eat whatever's in front of them, honestly, when they're hungry. And emphasis on when they're hungry, because predators don't just go around eating things all the time. That's actually not ecologically sound for them to do. But other things that you can do to kind of create a better coexistence is don't succumb to being an animal lover, is the way that I'm going to say it, because the study found, I think it was in 2014 or 15, that it's the people that identify as animal lovers that are one of the most likely to instigate these negative interactions, because they'll want the coyote, like, oh, coyote's so cute, I want to touch him, I want to talk to him, I want to let my pet play with him. Yes, people do let their dogs play with coyotes. I've watched many videos of people doing this and thinking it's cute.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's not good. Do not do it. Don't offer coyotes food or water. If they look skinny, it's because they are skinny. Coyotes are really lanky animals. They're really not that big. They only get to about 45 pounds over here on the West Coast, and they just have what I like to call the husky syndrome. They're just super floofy, but they're really skinny. That's just how they are, and you gotta stay out of it. Just stop instigating these interactions.
So that was a really great segue that I know that you did very intentionally, because you're working on a book that talks a little bit about what people who love animals, people who love the idea of conservation, but when it comes down to the action of conservation, or at least participating in the larger conservation movement in some ways, they're rigid, maybe resistant or ignorant. And I understand you want to speak to that in this new book you have coming out in the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is going to be called You're Not a Conservationist. And I've been sitting on this book for quite a while now. This is something that I am very, very passionate about, because there is this huge social media wave of people, whether that be people from Myrtle Beach, whether it be Brother Nature, whether it be Just people
Oh,
like,
you're gonna say names? You didn't want to
yeah.
say the name of the president, but you're gonna say Brother
No.
Nature. You're gonna say Brother Nature's name.
Yeah.
Wow,
I'm
wow.
I'm just saying. But there's this very specific group of people who like to feature wild animals on their social media accounts in a way that they really should not be. You should not be approaching wild animals and attempting to feed them, attempting to touch them, anything like that. They are wild animals. They need space and they deserve our respect. They deserve and need our respect. Connected to so many different problems if you're trying to feed or in any way physically interact with a wild animal. The reason is because the habituation that I talked about earlier, whether it be a deer, a coyote, a bear, if you're getting them used to human presence by feeding them or just simply trying to edge closer to them every time you happen across one, you're contributing to their death. Blatantly, that's what it is. You're contributing to their death. The reason being is because they're going to come back. They're going to keep coming back and looking for those food resources. They're going to keep coming back and looking for those interactions because it has rewarded them in some way, shape, or form in the past. And when that happens, there's no way to tell whether they're going to come back to a person who loves animals or is terrified of animals or just hates animals. You don't know if that person's going to call wildlife control and have that animal euthanized, which is what happens all the time. There's
Oh
so
yeah.
many reasons you should not be habituating wildlife, and that's exactly what you're doing if you are interacting with these animals in this way. Additionally, when it comes to accounts that feature, super quote unquote exotic animals like tigers and leopards and all kinds of stuff that, we only see in the zoos, but oh my goodness, this person gets to cuddle this animal. That's just so cool. Like, no, that's not okay. The reason for that is not conservation. That is entertainment, period. That animal is not seeking out human interaction. If you want to start going down the whole rabbit hole of what if they enjoy it? What if they want the interaction? No, they do not want the interaction. Ecologically and evolutionarily, human beings are an apex predator. Apex predators do not want to interact with other apex predators unless it's in that super mutualistic, really super cute way that we recently saw go viral on social media, on Twitter, of the coyote and the badger going hunting together. That's the thing. There are
But even then, as you said, that's a symbiotic relationship where they're
exactly.
not hanging out because they're cool,
Yeah,
which I
exactly.
think they definitely are cool.
That is a very specific interaction, specific relationship that has naturally evolved over the years. If you are putting an animal in captivity for the purpose of cuddling it, that's not natural. That is not in any way conducive to that animal's welfare. That animal will never be able to return to its natural environment because it has become so dependent on people for its food resources, for its shelter. It no longer has that ability to depend on its instinctual behavior in the way that it would have been trained in had it been raised by its own mother in its own natural habitat. Additionally, if you do release those animals back into the wild, because of their dependence on people, they're going to find human settlements, human civilizations, they're going to find these places and look for that support that they were given throughout their childhood, like they're people, but you know what I'm saying, throughout their
Yeah.
development stage. And another thing about interacting with wildlife is
Tell
there's
us.
so many zoonotic diseases that can be contracted between people and wildlife. I can't even go into it and even scratch the surface, but just don't do it.
I
Just
mean,
don't
I
do
won't
it.
scratch the surface, but I'll knock on the surface by reminding listeners that the bird flu was something that went from animals to humans. The swine flu is something that went from animals to humans, and Zika is something that went from animals to humans. Just off the top of my oh, and actually the coronavirus, right? Like the most recent, this one is something that came
Yeah.
from animals to humans. The exact chain of command, so to speak, I'm not familiar with, but I know that was something that started in an animal, mutated, and found its way to a human. Now a few humans, but
One of the other things too, when we're talking about diseases, and I don't mean to bring this back up, I'll just say it super briefly, but with the connection between feral cats and coyotes, there is I don't remember exactly what, it might be a flagellate, I'm not sure, but there is a disease and it's called Toxoplasma gondii. That is something that is spread from domestic cats. It can be any feline species, to my understanding. But when we support these feral cat colonies, they are carriers of this disease and can then spread it to any native mammal, because it's not specific to felines. That's just their what's the term? The ultimate host or something like that, where they do the reproductive cycle and then go to infect other species.
Wow.
But they can spread it to other native mammals, and native mammals includes us. So you can contract this disease by supporting feral cat colonies in these areas in certain ways, but then also intentionally physically interacting with wildlife. There's so many different risks associated with initiating unnecessary interactions with these animals, and also with in regards to people allowing their dogs and things to play with coyotes, which I'm still, when I say that, it's still a very confusing thing to me that people do that and think it's okay somehow. But one of the things that people don't really recognize is that vegetation is a huge indicator of coyote presence. And so if you have, that's why in suburban neighborhoods we see kind of a little bit more of a dense population of urban wildlife than we do elsewhere, because they have this vegetation to hide in and to reside in, things like that. So when you have really dense vegetation, that's also perfect habitat for mosquitoes. So why do I bring that up? That's because these mosquito species, Aedes cyarensis, they carry dog heartworm. And if you are allowing your dog to interact with, a coyote in close proximity or something like that, you're increasing its chances to contract dog heartworm from this coyote. But also, if you are somebody that has a lot of kind of unkept vegetation on your household, that is another attractant behavior, as far as, if there's fallen fruit or vegetables, if you have a garden, if you have standing water. These are all things that can contribute to the spread of disease between domestic animals and wildlife.
Oh wow, that sounds really great, and in fact, it inspired me to, I want to work with you some more and maybe get you on urban wildlife, so that we could. I think it'd be really creative if we, meaning probably you, Tony, and Billy, an actual scientist, work together to come up with a list of things that a new homeowner should understand about the wildlife around their house, not just the, when to take out the trash, when trash day is, when, septic system, yeah, we should know about that. But I think they should also know about, what happens when you put out food, what happens when you let your backyard be overgrown, or what happens when you let invasives into, there's just so many things that I think, like from what you said, we can really dig into that topic, and I mean, it would be arbitrary to make a top 10 list of things you shouldn't do as a homeowner to protect the environment, but I think that would be a clickbaity title that would get enough attention to people.
I've not thought of something like that before. That would be amazing, actually.
You're over here inspiring.
It doesn't really force someone to kind of dig into the literature or anything like that. It's just a how-to guide, just here's some things that you should avoid if you care about animals, period. Like it's really,
there you go.
It's something that I don't think people realize. These are really easy things to implement into your lifestyle, as far as just knowing how not to interact with wildlife, knowing what not to do around your household, like you're saying. These are really easy changes to make, but I think because of how we've been taught to think about coyotes, it seems like this huge task of like, oh my gosh, there's this native predator that I don't know anything about, and they're vicious and they kill livestock, and I don't know how to protect my family. Like, that's how the media makes us think about it. But it's really not. Coyotes are chilling. They just want to live. And there are just very simple things we can do to help them do that.
Absolutely. And, to be fair, when I Googled coyote, the first thing that came up was a story about a coyote attack in Chicago in January, a couple weeks ago.
I just saw that one. I can't even remember the full context of that story, but I immediately, when I see those stories, my first thought is, what did the person do? Because it is so rare that any animal, including predators, it doesn't matter how big or small that predator species is, it is so rare that an animal is just going to go up and attack you. But I have in the book, I do have a table that was written by a story, or not a story, a study in 20 something, I don't know, 2015, 2019, somewhere between there.
Yeah.
About just a level, a scale of habituation of coyotes and how you can start to determine, like, okay, maybe this coyote is either rabid or they're extremely habituated, or I'm doing something to contribute to their habituation. Because yes, I'm not gonna lie, there are some cases where a coyote will initiate contact between either a human and themselves or a domestic pet and themselves. However, that is not the norm. And the way that these stories are told is really feeding into that narrative that coyotes are just out to get everything. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. It just couldn't.
Very well said. Very, very well said. And I think something that you're doing, as one thing is you're talking about the problem, but and defining it really well. And I think in that, part of the effort that you're supporting is making a more clear, more accurate, more positive narrative for coyotes, or even in general wildlife management, from the idea of exterminating pests to finding a way to mitigate and better define the habitual nature between yourself and some of these predators, really. I mean, that I'm talking about specifically, because there are some pests that aren't predators, like bed bugs.
Yeah. I mean, hey,
just...
they can be considered predators. I mean, they're feeding on your blood. So
well,
they're
they make a lot of people pray. Yeah, they make a lot of people pray, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And so this is some of the work of SciComm, wouldn't you say?
Yes, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
with me being a very basic person, and for the what is it called? I guess for the book end of this conversation, I want to talk about SciComm again and really get in depth about how you are a creative and how you're a writer and how you use your platform with Black Flower Science Co. to do that.
Yeah, so that that definitely does get to the core of what my goal has always been. And I just want to repair the relationships between scientists and the general public, because that is something that has been so broken for so long. People do not trust scientists, I would venture to say, at all anymore. And so that's something that I think SciComm is just beautiful for, because it reminds people that scientists are human beings too, that we're not researching things to, for the purpose of conspiracy plans or anything like that. We're researching things because we care about them, we're curious, and we want to change things. And so I think SciComm just allows people to remember that, hey, scientists, they actually do have a reason to do what they're doing, and they want to teach people. And so it's all about kind of building that bridge between, a member of the general public who may have a slight interest in wildlife, to somebody that, whose life is dedicated to researching them, and kind of going into, rebuilding positive perspectives on predator species. I try to remain as broad in my topics as possible on my platform, but I always come back to coyotes because it's so important that people realize that this isn't a reductionist, intentionally reductionist thing to say, but they're just animals. They're just animals. And so are we. They're not out to get anybody. They're not planning anything to take over, human spaces or anything like that. They're just animals, and they're just trying to survive. And if we can see them as that, because we cannot see coyotes like that in this country. We absolutely can't. That we have to see them as some sort of villain. If we can see them as just another native species, then we can really start to give them the attention and protections that they deserve. Because I was surprised to find that even in research, we don't even study coyotes the way that we study other canine species. We just don't. We study wolves very much. Dogs are a very much up and coming model species, or model organism, excuse me, and a lot of cognitive research. A lot of wolves have been studied, foxes have been studied, but it's only just now starting a trend of people studying coyote ecology, or excuse me, coyote cognition, because we do know quite a lot about coyote ecology and behavior and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of catching up with other species, there's so much that hasn't been learned about coyotes. I believe that's just because of how negatively we view them. And so that's part of my goal, is just not only repairing that relationship between scientists and people, but also repairing that worldview and that perspective of, you know, maybe wildlife isn't really that bad. Maybe predatory species really aren't trying to eat my dogs and my children 24/7. Like, maybe there's actually something to this.
That's
So,
very well said.
yeah.
That's very, very well said. And Jasmine, I'd like to close this out with a word for wildlife. You said plenty of words. I've said plenty of words, but this is a segment I'm testing out where we just say one word and we can talk about that word. But because this is my show, I'm going to go first.
Okay.
My word is habit. It's a word that I think we've said in a lot of different ways, habitual being one of them, but I decided to go with habit. And my thought on the word habit is, if you can explain your habits in the form of a book, a single action is a word and a habit is a chapter. And those chapters can show a theme, and then that theme is obviously going to be what the book is about. And so when you think about what our habits have been and how these habits can describe how we treat wildlife or how we understand conservation, I think then that's when we can start peeling back and saying, okay, what are the actions that we're taking that's supporting this habit? What are the actions that we're taking that's supporting this narrative that, you know, is not helpful ultimately, and is not going to be helpful to us or wildlife in the long run.
Well,
So what is your word for wildlife?
so my word, it's kind of cheating, but it's kind of not cheating. So my word
You can do whatever you like.
life-giving. And my reason for that is because it's quite literal, but it's also figurative in a sense. The figurative side is just for me personally. This is so corny to say, but since I was a kid, I've always been all about wildlife. Like, my parents used to take me to San Diego Zoo. I have been, I've had hermit crabs and geckos. I've always loved wildlife, and they have been a source of just energy and passion and vitality in my life personally. And in a literal sense, is wildlife includes non-vertebrates. Wildlife includes flora species. It includes moss and fungi and just all sorts of stuff. And so it is the very foundation on which we build our entire civilization, yet we have this arrogance that we don't need it, or that it's something that is only there to be utilized by us. And the level of, I guess I'll say arrogance again, the level of arrogance or I guess disdain for wildlife is sad for me to see, because it's what gives us life. And so I would really say that the life-giving is a very definitive term for me when thinking about the natural world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that word. We really needed that word. Now with that, I guess this is where we say toodaloo for now. I mean, I tried not to make too many guarantees while we're on the podcast, but I definitely would love to have you chat more with my colleagues about urban wildlife, to, even talk about your upbringing more in that, because, I find that really fascinating. And, as someone who prides themselves to communicate this kind of science and communicate the identity of this science and the story of the scientist, I think that you have a pretty good voice to share with a lot of people, and I hope we can get you on the podcast again or get you some other podcasts very soon.
Heck yeah, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
I'm really glad we could talk this out, and I really hope we can talk again more.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Jasmine, and thank you everybody for listening. I don't know what the next episode is going to be because I really want to talk about NEPA, really want to talk about the National Environmental Protection Act because that's one of the rollbacks that we're talking about, one of the ones that's getting a lot of fights from a lot of different environmental groups. But that's such an evolving topic, and it's and it would be hard to find a guest for such a topic. Maybe we'll do a panel. I'm thinking out loud. But either way, very happy that we could have you, Jasmine, and we want you to come back sometime soon. Okay, please.
Thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. You have a good rest of your evening.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.